singing, dancing. These are some of the sounds and rhythms that pulse through African villages, reflecting the very heartbeat of tribal life. It may be the twang of strings, the drone of drums, the piping of flutes, or voices blended in chanting and song. There are many sounds in the villages, but if it is a sound of music, singing and dancing, it is likely to be the sound of people at worship, or people at work, or people at play. Dancing enters virtually into all aspects of tribal life. It can be purely a form of recreation or part of a very important religious ceremony. There's dancing when a child is born, and dancing when it receives its name. And in the initiation lodges where boys and girls are prepared for adulthood, there's always plenty of dancing. And dancing when they emerge to rejoin their families, and both dancing and feasting when they return to their homes. Now, this intense love for dancing can be best summed up in the words of Chief Nwelemondo of Venderland. He told me a few years ago that his people love dancing so much that they keep on dancing until they are very old and their legs refuse to dance. But even then, he said, while we keep on watching and we keep on listening, somehow we just keep on dancing inside. The Ingomar is carved in one piece from the trunk of the marula tree. The oxhide skin is stretched across the top and fixed to the rim with stout pegs. It has very solid handles which belong to the same block. The Ingomar is played with sticks, whereas the marimba, this one, is played between the legs with the hands. It is also made from marula tree and is hollow. But neither the Ingomar nor the marimba has a fixed pitch or tone, but this can be controlled by applying pressure with the left hand. This indigenous bugle is made from the horn of the sable antelope and is known as the quata. In distant times, Venda, Tsonga, Lubedu and other chieftains of the northern Transvaal used it mainly for mustering their regiments in times of war. Today, however, it is used mainly for calling people together to meetings in the kgoro or tribal place. This instrument, with its haunting sound, is played in many parts of Xhosa territory. The bow is actually a very thin reed, and the player's mouth is used as a resonator to give greater substance to the sound. There's not very much I can say about these two instruments, except that this is a homemade banjo and this is a homemade guitar. But what makes them so unusual is the fact that I found them being played by Bushmen in two different parts of the Kalahari Desert. Now, obviously, they must have learnt about these instruments by coming into contact with the Bakalakhadi and other tribes of the desert. The ugubu is a Zulu instrument and is used for accompaniment in singing. The calabash serves as a resonator, and variances in tone can be achieved by applying finger pressure to the string. One of the more fascinating aspects of indigenous tribal instruments, apart from the sound they make, is their very simplicity. Take, for example, these three flutes. They've been made out of mealie stalks, which have been hollowed out and sealed on either end with clay, the holes having been burnt into the stalks with heated metal. Rattles used in dancing are made of many materials, including butterfly cocoons or moth cocoons. And these are usually tied around the ankles or the wrist or around the waist. They sound like this when the dancing is taking place. Changes are everywhere evident in the composition of musical instruments. I procured this little xylophone for my collection in northern Mozambique. Now, traditionally, the resonators were made out of little gourds or calabashes. But it is not uncommon to find today that polish tins are used and jam tins. Indigenous music has undergone change in recent decades, mainly as a result of an ever-increasing listenership to radio throughout Southern Africa. New tunes and rhythms have merged with traditional ones to bring about a form of indigenous or semi-indigenous jazz, which is known as mbaqanga. Now, mbaqanga is neither totally tribal nor totally American, but a marriage between the two. I've seen considerable change taking place in the regalia and in the ornaments worn by tribal dancers. In former times, regimental dancers could be recognized at a glance by the markings on their shields, by the plumes and skins they wore as headdresses, and by the kilts they wore, also made of skin. But today, it is not entirely uncommon to find even important regiments dressed in all kinds of regalia, and much of this depends upon the individuality and the ingenuity of each person. In some tribal areas, even the steps so long adhered to by tribal dancers have undergone change. And this is particularly conspicuous among adolescent school-going boys and girls. Not so long ago, I attended a festive occasion in Botswana, and there were middle-aged and more elderly people dancing in traditional style to traditional music. But close by, the younger people were jiving. And this I've seen in other parts of the country. Traditionally, tribal peoples relied on nature for their raw materials, from which they made beads and other items of ornamentation. It was only when itinerant traders came into the interior of Southern Africa that this was to change. Now, I have a few examples of beadwork here, merely to demonstrate how raw materials and indigenous materials were put to use. The materials used are clay, grass, porcupine quills, strips of wood, seeds, ostrich eggshell, and here we have seashells. The necklace I value most is this one, which is made from Mamba vertebrae. It once belonged to a medicine man known as La Duma Madela. When he passed away, it was given to Chief Gacha Buthelezi, who in turn presented to me for my collection. Beads made in overseas countries have long been known to Africa, having been brought into the interior by Arab and Portuguese traders. They're inclined to be a little dull in color. But in 1828, new beads were brought into the country by two itinerant traders called Robert Schoon and William McLuckie. And they caused quite a sensation among the Matabele, who were then living north of Pretoria. In their diaries, they mention the jubilance of Mzilikazi, the conqueror, the king of the Matabele or Ndebele, who swore he would never use Portuguese beads again. The colors in beadwork reflect the moods of the maker, and especially in olden times, colors had many connotations. Now let us have a look at some of the colors and their meanings. Now yellows have very positive connotations because they are associated with the harvest, the many colors of the crops. The light yellow, this suggests virginity and impending marriage. The very beautiful autumn shades, the orange and vermilions that one finds in those ripening gourds and pumpkins, they are also very, very positive colors. All the greens have very, very positive meanings because they are associated with the growth in spring and in summer, and they're also associated with the health-giving plants, the shrubs and the herbs and leaves. There are so many shades of blue, all with their own connotations. But now the blue of the sky, the azure, denotes happiness. And the blue of the sea means power, authority, and strength. And then one comes to the darker blues, the ultramarine. Now, ultramarine is associated with the feathers of the iguala. That is the purple-crested lory bird. And this is a very restless bird, and so ultramarine is a restless color. Now, the reds are unhappy colors. The opaque reds are very close to blood, and so they are associated with strife and fear and tears. The transparent reds are associated with lightning and with fire, and they denote anger and all ominous situations. Among women, beaded ornaments usually differ according to age groups and social status. For example, beads worn by married women are not worn by girls during puberty, and those worn by girls who have recently emerged from initiation lodges are different from those worn, say, by brides. In other words, they are not purely decorative, but may also indicate rank, age, and status. After marriage, the women of some of the tribes grow their hair very long, such as this one in KwaZulu. But among other tribes, hair is closely shorn, and the practice of cutting hair down to the scalp is common during times of mourning. These Mpondo girls have plaited their hair with a mixture of clay and fat. As the hair grows long, the tips are sometimes molded and shaped into lavish styles. Headman Muloto is of the Mulechi tribe in Lubua. His headdress is made of animal hide brimmed with porcupine quills. In a traditional situation, cosmetics are limited to clays of various colors, to fat which is rubbed into the skin, and to indigenous sweet-smelling powders. Now, among the Xhosa and other tribal groups, the women are expert at decorating their faces and bodies with clay. But the Xhosa also lighten their skin with a bleaching agent which is made from the bark of a tree known as memezi. It is actually a thorn tree. The bark is ground into a powder, and this is then boiled up in water and applied to the skin. Apart from the people who inhabit the more northerly reaches of southern Africa in the region of the Zambezi, the Southern African tribes are not really sculptors. They are, however, outstanding carvers of household utensils, of furniture and ornaments. Now let me show you one or two examples of carving that I have in my collection. This chair, for example, I found in northern Mozambique. It was carved from a solid tree trunk. The same applies to this three-legged stool, which was given me by Mujaji IV, the legendary Rain Queen of the North. Now, wooden milk pails such as these have virtually died out in southern Africa, except in the remotest parts. This one is particularly valuable. It was given me by Batweng II, paramount chief of the Bangwaketsi of Botswana. And he is an elderly man, and this belonged to his great-great-grandfather, which does give us some indication of its age. The same applies to these bellows. They are very ancient. The two limbs have been carved from solid wood, and the two parts missing are the clay nozzles which fit into the fire when the bellows are pumped like this. This sculpture of King Dingane was made by a Tsonga man in the eastern Transvaal. These pieces are from Barotsi land in the region of the Zambezi River. Today, Western influences are clearly reflected in tribal sculpture. Most of the items made in tribal areas are for utilitarian purposes, items for daily use. Virtually all of the tribes are expert mat weavers. The Xhosa are particularly adept at pipe making. It's true to say that handcraft is not art in the conventional sense. It is an integral and essential part of tribal life. Where things are not readily available, the only alternative is to make them. And many of these handmade articles are highly durable and excellent in quality. Unfortunately, the art of pottery is dying out in some parts of southern Africa. This is mainly due to the availability of inexpensive plastic and enamel ware at trading stores. But here in Vendoland, pottery is still widely practiced. This is one of the most respected potters in the district of Sibasa. She produces about 15 to 20 high-quality pots a week. She uses no wheel for molding and shaping her products, yet every pot is an example of outstanding workmanship. The clay, incidentally, comes from the immediate vicinity of her home. In former times, ochre would have been used for coloring pots. But today, shoe polish, lead, and household paints are also used. Apprenticeship for this skilled and demanding art begins at an early age. This potter's 6-year-old daughter is already receiving training in the rudiments of firing and baking pots. Changes are taking place in tribal societies. In fact, this potter no longer produces items purely for personal use. Her wares are sold to the local community, a further example of Western influences. Now, as contacts are constantly made between cultures, change is a natural process. And in view of the fact that we are living in an era of rapid change, I thought it worthwhile probing the opinions of one or two of the more prominent black personalities of this country in this regard.
Change, I don't know, perhaps I should say cross fertilization, not so much change, because the change is really not quite there. You see, in the urbanized areas of Lahore, you don't hear much of these traditional music. But in the rural areas where the chiefs are and the hitmen and the people are, you have plenty of it in its right form. And so I think it's been retained with pride. In fact, if we go to the hinterland and we have any celebrations there, the biggest attraction is to listen to the traditional music, which makes men and women and children to participate wholeheartedly in the rhythm and the dancing and so on.
We shall be very sorry if ever our culture is lost and we get confused with many cultures, you see, because there will never be a Venda nation without its own culture. I have a section dealing with the culture, and then there is a body established, that is the Venda Bureau of Culture and Language. And then that body tries to bring back good cultures of the people, see, and then making the Bavenda conscious of their own culture, and it tries to preserve these cultures. You see.
Well, I think it's inevitable. I think acculturation is accepted everywhere. But I would like to stress that one of the very first things we did in KwaZulu, when KwaZulu was set up in the way it is set up now, was to establish a Bureau for Zulu Language and Culture, because we are very proud of our culture and our language, and we believe that a culture of a people is the people, it really comprises the people's soul.
We are very proud of the kind of artifacts that we see in our collection here in Boer. And of course, it's not only the music, instruments like pipes that you see, you also see the drums, you know, made of wood and skin in very skillful way. And we would like to perpetuate the collection of these things and the making of these instruments as part and parcel of our culture.
But of course, we cannot cramp the style in education and development for the sake of culture too. Clearly, it is quite clear that there are some aspects of our culture which cannot survive, you know, development. But at the same time, just like the Japanese, I think that we need, you know, technical development, but at the same time retaining our culture.
You know, in a multilingual setup like South Africa is, where you hear not only North Sotho, you also hear Afrikaans and English and the other indigenous languages. As a result of the contact that we are having with the various language groups, our language is coining a lot of new words as we try to express or adapt them to technology and science. And there is this cross-fertilization, which is a very remarkable achievement. In that way, instead of a language being impoverished, it's being enriched.
Which brings us to the most basic form of communication, namely the spoken word. So let us very briefly consider a few aspects of the vernacular languages. A striking feature is the fact that they are very closely related, which doesn't mean that languages spoken in the East will be intelligible to people living in the remote West, or that languages spoken in the distant South will be understood by people in the extreme North. In actual fact, a Xhosa-speaking man coming from, say, the Ciskei into the Pedi, Venda, and Tsonga group of languages in the north will find those languages impossible to understand, if not very difficult. Now, the real similarities of these languages are to be found in the grammatical structure. The fact that nouns are grouped into 8 distinct classes, and there are the similarities in declension, conjugation, syntax, and so on. A fascinating feature of the languages spoken along the east coast among the Xhosa, the Zulu, and Swazi is the characteristic clicks. Now, the first click is formed on the side of the mouth, like ikoto, a frog, kabana, to argue, kholisa, to quieten. Then there's a click that is formed right in front of the mouth, like kula, kula, to sing. Utwetwe is a wafer, and isitutu, a fragment of something. Then there's a sharp click, which is also formed in the front of the mouth, that click. Now this sounds like this one, kakazela, to shiver, or ngongibelo, Saturday, or umgwaqo, a road. And finally there are the frigatives, formed on the side of the mouth, like hlupa, hlaba, hlonipa. Now, African languages are particularly rich in idiom. There are hundreds of proverbs. Now, one proverb says, "Akukho zinkunzi zihlala ndawonye," which means that bulls don't live happily together. What this really means is that when powerful men live together or work together, they are far more likely to argue than to cooperate with each other. Another proverb says that the baby that cries most receives most of its mother's breast. What this really means is that if a person doesn't speak up in life, he is likely to be overlooked. And there's another proverb, and this one says that the man that relishes the flesh of a partridge must learn how to hunt, and he must learn the habits of that elusive bird, because he cannot expect to succeed in life without the necessary expertise and the necessary effort. And I find vernacular languages exceptionally beautiful and immensely expressive. You know, there are many ways of greeting in vernacular languages. For example, the Basotho will say, "Kgotso," which means peace. And a little while ago, when I was researching in Israel, I found the greeting to be Shalom, peace.